Welcome to Cocktail Menu Design for the People. Even before the pandemic, cocktail menus were a critical piece in a bar's offer and an area that was being explored, expanded, and perfected constantly. Combining creative branding with key functionality, a great menu informs and inspires and sets the tone for a guest's experience and the bar's brand. In light of COVID-related restrictions, the menu is having to adapt and evolve even more. Cocktail bars tackling printed menu updates in-house far outweigh those that can afford to send projects to a graphic designer or professional printer every time changes must be made. It is important to understand the elements, both practical and aesthetic, that go into a functional cocktail menu, so that as a bar owner, manager, or even an employee contributing to the drinks list, best design practices can help ensure that the menu is both effective and beautiful, something every bar, regardless of size or budget, deserves. In this seminar, we'll highlight the main graphic design elements that every bar should consider for a successful menu, both in its first printing and beyond. And our speaker today has both expertise and experience. With a degree in graphic design, Amanda Elder joined the bar opening team of Pouring Ribbons in 2012, and as creative director was responsible for designing the bar's initial thematic menus, such as Route 66, Silk Road, and Moody Authors. Amanda joined Skurnik Wines and Spirits in 2017, where she focuses on spirits education and collateral design for seminars and events. Amanda continues to freelance in hospitality design and believes that each project is enriched by her time as a bartender. So, over to you, Amanda.
Lovely. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Angus, and thank you, everyone, for joining me today to talk about menu design. This is a topic that I'm tremendously passionate about. And I think it's a practical aspect of programs that isn't necessarily talked about enough as far as the nuts and bolts that realistically go in to completing menus and making changes over time. It's an integral part of every bar model, and yet we tend to celebrate final aesthetics without really talking about what goes into it. So I'm excited today to get into a little bit of that nitty-gritty. That having been said, by no means do I mean for this to be a masterclass in graphic design, and this is certainly not a talk that's meant to replace the very important collaborations that happen between graphic designer and bar owners or bar managers. There are certain things you'll find a professional touch is going to help with and going to more efficiently finish these pieces for you in a way that you need. That having been said, the practicality of it is that a lot of the time menu flips are, mild changes to the menu or even big changes to the menu are being handled in-house by management or by someone on your team that you've assigned to help with these things. And I think that it's important to try and get used to the vocabulary within this conversation and to really keep certain aspects of design in mind throughout that process in order to ensure that you end up with the best possible solution for your specific space. So that having been said, let's get into a bit. I'm gonna share my screen with you. We'll see how this goes. All right, let's see. Yes, I think that'll work. Okay, so in order to have this conversation, and today we're going to talk a little bit about some, not very sexy but hyper practical aspects of menu design, and a little bit of the more theoretical and aesthetic aspects of menu design. In order to do both of those things, we need to establish a couple of ground rules or truths about design in general. The first of those truths is that a menu is ultimately a sales tool. This may seem kind of obvious, but I promise you that throughout the process of design, which is really a long string of both big and small aesthetic choices, right? Some of them are conscious and some of them are quite unconscious, but each move you make within the design process is a choice. Once you're sort of caught up in this minutia, and I use minutia in the most loving terms because as a graphic designer, I really love diving into all of those tiny variables and choices that result in a finished product. But when you are sort of like head down in this minutia, it's easy to forget that this is a functional sales tool for your business. It is ultimately meant to communicate the offerings that you have for sale to your guests. And sometimes when we get caught up in the aesthetic side of things, we forget that this is meant to be a tool that a guest can use in the most functional way to make a decision. This can affect everything from, table turnover times to just, them deciding on the best option for them within any given menu. So I promise you that if you keep this, very simple idea in mind, sort of repeat it like a mantra as you're going through a design process, you will end up with a more functional menu at the end of the day. Menu is ultimately a sales tool. Now, second, a menu is a living document. And I think this is something that is very easy to forget when perhaps a space is new and you're creating your initial branding and you're thinking about that first product, this opening gambit menu that's going to relay the voice of your program and all of these amazing selections that you have chosen to offer your guests. But realistically, no bar or restaurant is creating one menu with all of the information set in stone forever. There are always going to be small changes that need to be made, and sometimes big changes that need to be made, especially when you're thinking about a modern cocktail program where it might be tremendously important to rotate through certain selections. So, this could be anything from changing up your beer and wine, so that you're featuring seasonal choices. Certainly this has to do with rotating cocktails, both within a seasonal mindset and also to sort of remain offering new and exciting things for your guests. This could be something as simple as switching out spirits that have become unavailable that you intended on using, for the next 5 months, and all of a sudden, a whiskey that you presented on your menu by name isn't going to be available for the next 3 months. These changes need to be made. Especially now in this moment with COVID, this idea that the menu is a living document has become more important than ever. Now, here within the States, if we're talking about, government rules and regulations per state, they can vary widely and they can change from week to week. Everything from whether or not you want to reuse your menus and what it takes to clean those off versus are you giving those menus to your guests to handle physically. Are you even using a handheld menu anymore, or is it more reasonable for you to use sandwich boards or tabletop menus? All of these things are going to affect format and probably change up, what you've been using previously. And by no means in this moment does that mean you're going to settle on one solution that isn't going to change as these rules and regulations and the reality of COVID-19 really affect our businesses. Everything from budgeting and staffing considerations may have you limiting what you're even offering right now. So you may be doing simpler menus than you have been in the past, but perhaps those menus are going to end up expanding again once you're able to staff more or invite more guests to join you. So the more that you can keep in mind that this document is something that is going to need changes made to it, either on a regular basis or a semi-regular basis, building that into your business model from the beginning is going to make everything run a little bit more smoothly and help you avoid the kind of, budgetary hiccups that can happen if you don't think about who's actually making these changes, who's printing these, who is responsible for, all these tiny things. Should it be your manager or someone in-house that handles this stuff? Is it worth the cost of time for them to be dealing with these issues, or is it more efficient to be handing this off to a graphic designer? These are questions you need to decide for yourself, but there's certainly questions that need to be apparent right from the beginning of the conversation. And then finally, I want to say that regardless of whether or not you're engaging the services of a graphic designer, the menu content that you are relaying on the page or digitally is coming from you. A graphic designer at the end of the day is meant to take the information that you give them and present it in a beautiful way, either through collaboration or an idea that they present to you. They're caught up in ideas like typesetting or what sort of imagery perhaps is going to go with everything and sort of the nuts and bolts back end of these things. But the actual information that they're putting on the page is up to you as a bar owner, as a bar manager. And every single choice that you make matters. You are in control of the message that you're trying to relay to your guests. The more explicit that you can be with this information from the beginning of the design process, the more efficient this process is going to be. And the more you're going to make sure that the end message that you have is exactly what you wanted it to be for your business. So these are kind of broad ideas that I want to get into in a little bit more of a specific way by using pouring ribbons, where I once worked as a test case. Even now, years after I've left this particular job, it still remains for me the primary touchstone of experience for how I approach menu design. I have a degree in graphic design, as Angus mentioned. I went to Parsons, which is part of the New School here in New York. I graduated in the summer of 2012. For years and years before I went back to school for this degree in graphic design, I was a server and a bartender, primarily in British and Irish pubs. Cocktails weren't really a part of my life at that point in time. But that summer that I graduated school, I was lucky enough to land a job on the opening staff of Pouring Ribbons, which is located in the East Village here in New York, in Manhattan. This was a really big deal for me because it was the first time that I was immersed in cocktails, which means I was experiencing this huge learning curve about not only spirits education, but cocktail format and education technique, and how to communicate those things to guests. So I think timing really lined up for me here, where because I was learning how to communicate ideas of cocktails while I was also talking to guests about these things, I was able to really look at everything that we were doing from the guest perspective and from kind of this lowest common denominator of, if you have a guest that's coming into a bar, how do you make this information relatable to them? How do you make it a comfortable environment where you're not inundating them with complex cocktail information and helping them make good choices and ultimately ending up with a drink in hand that they truly want and enjoy. This was also my first job on an opening staff for a space, so I had the ability to see the evolution that naturally happens between a beginning idea and the practicalities that you have to make adjustments for once you're actually up and running and you're doing service. Everything from how the space is used and where those bottlenecks end up being, to how people are using the menu, and realistically how to most efficiently offer information to guests. So Pouring Ribbons, their initial branding was created by an amazing design firm based here in New York called Warren Red. So like many businesses, a budget was set aside to hire a graphic design firm to create both the logo, the menu, they did the interior design as well, and all ancillary branding. So these are things like the postcards that we used as menu check presenters. So all of these things were put into place, but it was always the intention of Pouring Ribbons, from a build out, the initial build out, management's idea, that initial and subsequent menu changes would be made in-house. So Warren Red took this menu and the files in which they had created this menu, handed them over to Pouring Ribbons, and management said to themselves, we're going to change up this menu seasonally, and we're going to print it in-house without giving it back to Warren Red to make these changes for us. This initial menu was made in InDesign, by the way, which is pretty common, and we'll talk a bit about file types in a second. So having just come off of my time in graphic design school, I offered to help with these initial changes because they didn't necessarily have someone within management, within the opening partners, that was so fluent in these files that they were perfectly fine with taking care of it themselves, or even that their time should have been spent focusing on this particular aspect of the menu. So I helped with that initial menu, and then we were kind of off to the races. Every menu change that we made at Pouring Ribbons over the next 4 years, I handled personally. So in the beginning, this meant being sort of a custodian for the initial branding and the setup of the menu. Rather than making any sort of meaningful changes, I was literally going into this file, changing some of the cocktail solutions. Now, their initial plans for seasonal menu changes were pretty aggressive. They were doing quarterly menu changes. So every 3 months, we were changing at least something on the menu, Twice a year, these changes were minimal. And twice a year, both in the spring and the fall, they were making quite substantial changes to the menu. So most of the cocktails were being taken off, 99% of them, and replaced with new cocktails. What this meant for pouring ribbons was that this was going to really affect a couple of things, specifically this flavor matrix that we used to help plot the style of menu, which was a really ingenious visual device that the partners first came up with. So everything was plotted, this idea between comforting and adventurous and refreshing and spirituous, to help you kind of figure out if reading the description of a cocktail wasn't particularly intuitive, it would help you figure out the general vibe of a drink. This matrix ended up being, a really big part of how people ended up deciding what they were going to drink. This also affected what happened on the regular page of the menu. All of these drinks were split up between house cocktails and classic cocktails, and there were rotations between both sections, and everything was listed alphabetically. So even if you had something that was staying on the menu, over the course of the flip, where it was located on the page may change depending on where it landed alphabetically. Same for the matrix, because even though it was plotted in a certain point on one menu, this matrix was laid out, in relation to all of the other drinks. Something is only can only be considered spirituous when you're putting it in context to the other things that you're offering. So where it was plotted on the menu on the matrix may have changed as well. So I have the ability to see how all of these tiny changes, placement on the page, placement within the matrix, were starting to affect how people selected their drinks. What ultimately this ended up meaning was that I ended up lucky enough to experience almost a scientific study of the communication between menu and guest in this control setting. The space was remaining the same, but the menu, even though a lot of its elements were remaining the same as well, had all these tiny variations that were happening. And because I was waiting tables and because I was bartending, I was able to witness how people were handling the menu, both physically and also how they were reading it. Because they didn't know that I was involved in the ultimate design of these menus or the ultimate execution in the beginning, they were very honest in front of me, couples that were having conversations saying, what does this mean, or, sort of handling the menu roughly in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have done if I had been standing in front of them saying, look, I helped make this thing, So I really got a bird's eye view of how people were starting to use the menu and how their decision-making process was being affected by seemingly small changes. So again, we've got a couple of spreads here from the first couple of years of menus. So even here on the matrix to this far left, you can see this was from, I believe, a winter menu. So we had a couple of hot drink options on the menu. And where green represented classic cocktails and blue represented house-made cocktails, original cocktails, red represented hot cocktails. And it was very interesting to see how even these punctuations of color within the matrix would draw the eye to these particular selections. People wanted to know what was up with these changes in color. Even if they ultimately decided they weren't in the mood for a hot drink, color was very much affecting where the eye was drawn on the page and what they were looking at first. I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the time within the decision-making process, if someone feels intimidated by their selections, they tend to go for the first thing they see that seems somewhat appealing. So there's a lot of power in where the eye goes first on the page. Now, of course, this isn't a hard and fast rule. You certainly have people, depending on the space and how much time you're allowing them to interact with the menu, that will really take their time in making a decision. And we could certainly go into a pretty deep rabbit hole about that aspect of menu psychology and people's decision-making choices and what affects those decisions, not only in menu design, but sort of in design in general. But this was certainly sort of one of the first small changes that I saw that was, really starting to affect, how people decided what they were going to have. One of the next amendments that we made to the menu was starting to use icons for the drinks and the glassware that they were presented in. We just saw that over the course of that first year, this was a really meaningful aspect of how people were making their drink decisions or how people were experiencing the drink once it got to them. It's sort of like the classic example of, a gentleman that ends up with a drink in a stemmed glass and a very ornate garnish, that, even if the ingredients within the glass are, right on par with what he was in the mood for, it might be that format was not what he was looking for. Now, that's an incredibly gender biased example, but you will find that the more information people have, the more they'll be able to make a decision that they find is going to make them comfortable, both aesthetically and from a flavor standpoint, and both are important. So we started creating these small icons that we just used as an amendment to the initial menu descriptions so that people had an idea of what glassware their drinks were going into. And again, as I said before, here's a full page spread. We were doing 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper that were folded down the middle. So you had these long vertical menus. And again, I found that people had a tendency to scan information. Now, this is very true of digital information as well. There's a lot of research about how people input information and user interface on websites or blog posts, and how they tend to scan information and where their eyes lock and really start to take things in versus what they'll just sort of gloss over and not pay attention to. And I saw very quickly that people were scanning the top drink on the page and the bottom drink on the page. And stuff in the middle, depending on the guest, they may look more closely at that, they may not. It wasn't dissimilar to what was happening on the Matrix. You had people looking at this top drink, which was usually ended up being the Moscow Mule, which rarely ever left the menu and, was incredibly comforting and refreshing. So it usually inhabited that top left corner. So they were looking over there, and they were looking at the bottom right-hand page, which was the booziest drink, so people almost saw this as like a challenge. A lot of people wanted, the most aggressive thing on the menu because, they liked that you were saying, try this out. It's pretty intense. So we would often field questions mostly about these two portions of the matrix or those two portions of the page. And again, as I said, the drinks were listed alphabetically. So, we were sort of choosing an arbitrary way of of displaying this information, but that ultimately really affected what people had a tendency to order. And that's something to keep in mind, because even if you're not using, an alphabetic organization of your selections, both, in print or on a digital platform, the order in which you place these drinks could sincerely affect how people are choosing, depending on how people scan a page, and this tendency to look at the top option and the bottom option before they necessarily even take in information about everything in between. So if there's something you're really trying to push, or something that isn't necessarily as intuitive as a drink, it might merit putting in one of these sort of like high quality real estate parts of the menu so that people will naturally ask about it, instead of sort of burying the lead in this middle bit of information. Perhaps if there's a drink that people are going to order no matter what, because the description is so attractive, it's, refreshing, it's, or it's a classic that people always love and are going to order, maybe that's better placed in these middle areas because, people are going to ask for that drink anyway. So something to keep in mind. And then in fall of 2015, we switched things up aggressively and switched to these thematic menus, starting with Route 66. So very much based in this idea of Americana. At this point, we were a couple of years into the opening and my personal handling of these menus, so they allowed me a little bit more room with how the menu was designed, and getting away from that initial branding to really bring these themes to life. But there were certain things that were going to, of course, remain the same. Because we were printing in-house, we were still using the same format of these long vertical pages, 8.5 by 11. And mostly using black and white as our primary, colors, with these pops of other color. But two really interesting things happened that I discovered within this menu that, I didn't necessarily realize were going to be a thing going into it. I based this design on the initial tasting mats that in the 40s, 50s, 60s used to be found in roadside diners along Route 66 that would sort of map out all of the interesting, side attractions that you could stop at along the way. These were pretty dense pages, but these really beautiful layouts of certain parts of the highway. So I wanted to do something that approximated that on the menu. So for each drink, I assigned an image, an icon, if you will. And some of these were, vintage drawings, others were things that I made myself, but each drink, based on sort of the general idea that went behind it, got an image. That was one thing that we switched up pretty aggressively. The other thing was that rather than having one page that was all house cocktails and one page that was all classic cocktails, we mixed them all together. And of course, two things started happening immediately. One, people were attracted to certain drinks based on the icon that they thought was particularly interesting. And two, people started ordering more of the classic cocktails. I think there had been this sort of subconscious mindset that if they were going to go to a space that was considered in some ways, very much a destination bar and very much known for its original cocktails, then you weren't experiencing it properly if you ordered a classic. You could get a classic anywhere, which we of course know isn't exactly true. There's still a lot of interpretation to be made within any good classic drink. We did a lot of really amazing things in those classic selections. But just generally speaking, people tended to gravitate towards the house cocktails. But when we made it a little less obvious what was a house cocktail versus what was a classic, people started paying more attention to both the icons that we were assigning these drinks and the descriptions of the drinks themselves. And, we ended up finding that sales of classic cocktails just shot through the roof compared to what they had once been. So I don't want to dive too much deeper into this, test study, but I wanted to give you a visual example of just how many variables can start affecting how people are making decisions on the menu. I think this is a really exciting and sort of fascinating study, and certainly not one that has any absolute answers. There's a lot that's going to go into it. And ultimately, it's, you have this X factor that is an individual space or bar, or restaurant program that is always going to affect the menu in a way that, isn't going to be apparent in any other situation. We could have translated this pouring ribbons menu within this format to any other space, and there would have been changes in how people interacted with it, right? Because it wasn't in the pouring ribbons space, and that is true of any program. But I think the more you're aware of these elements and the more you sort of stay conscious of them as you see your menus, either print or digital, being used by your guests, the more you can start really sort of filing away information about how people are using your menu and what sort of amendments you might be able to use to your advantage to sell certain things or to make that decision-making process for your guests more intuitive. So we're going to get back to a little bit of this menu psychology conversation near the end of the talk, but I want to get into some of, as I was saying before, the less sexy aspects of design, but I think are really important because they're just not talked about as much within the industry. So let's get into it, beginning with file types. Now, there are only a certain number of files that you're generally going to find your menu has been created in, especially if you've started with a collaboration with a graphic designer and then they are then handing off this menu to you to make subsequent changes. Most of these files are going to exist within the Adobe suite of files, specifically Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, and InDesign. And each of these files, each of these file types, each of these programs, even though they have certain things in common, and some of their user interface is set up the same way, obviously they're meant to be able to easily be used together in concert, they do have specific purposes that they were originally meant to be used for. Illustrator, as you would imagine, was meant to be used specifically for illustration and vector-based illustration. When we say vector-based, what we're talking about is this sort of point-to-point organic illustration that is more akin to you drawing a line on a page. This is really good for detailed illustrations of any kind that you want to create digitally instead of by hand. Photoshop is pixel-based. So now we're talking about pixels or rasters. These are essentially small squares of information that build up imagery. And this is really meant as a digital platform. Photoshop is amazing, as you can imagine, for editing photography or changing certain aspects of an image. It's fantastic for layering certain textures and colors onto an image, kind of like what you do with Instagram with filters these days. Before Instagram existed, you would have gone into Photoshop to make these types of changes. So this is a really useful program for that, but it's not meant for really original illustration. And of course, I say that with the caveat that there are designers out there that can create insanely detailed illustrations using Photoshop. But it's not really meant for that at the end of the day, and certainly not meant as a go-to file preparation program for print, which is really important to remember. And then you have InDesign. Now, most menus that you're using, most files for menus will have been created in InDesign. If you're asking for the original editable file in which you can go in and make changes, 99% of the time what you're going to get is an InDesign document. This is because InDesign was really set up to be the most friendly for typography and typesetting, and for creating multi-page documents. Now you can do both of those things, not really so much in Photoshop, but you can definitely do it in Illustrator, but it's not quite as clean. You can't set up as much infrastructure for easily making changes to your pages or the order of your page numbers, for instance. Typography just has a little bit more of an intuitive interface for these types of things. So a lot of the time, this is what your menu design documents are going to be made in. You'll find that most graphic designers gravitate towards one Adobe Suite program more than the other for a lot of the work that they like to do. I, for instance, love using Adobe Illustrator. I like to create digital illustrations. But if I'm doing menu design, even if I'm creating images for that menu within Illustrator, I will probably import those images into InDesign for the final files, especially the files that I need to hand off to the client once it's all finished. And then, of course, we have a lot of love for Microsoft Word. So the trick with Microsoft Word is that, unlike these Adobe files, people tend to know how to use it, right? It's not really meant for design, it's meant for writing. And I still, if I'm copywriting things, I will create those pieces of information in Word, because it's automatically going to do things like, look at word counts and, show me when something is spelled incorrectly, or look at grammatical errors. Whereas, the Adobe programs, they will do that, but you have to ask the programs to do that for you. And even then, it won't necessarily pick up on things as intuitively as Word is. So I like to create copy a lot of the time in Word, but it's really not meant for design. It's certainly not meant for complex typographic systems. It's going to make it harder for you. It's especially tough when you're trying to format images and text together. It likes to really change things in wonky ways that you wouldn't expect. You just can't control where things are on the page the same way that you can in these other files. So one of the first questions I always ask clients when I start a new project is, are you going to be making these changes in-house? How often are you planning on making these changes? Because that's going to directly affect how I set up these files. A big follow-up question to that is, do you know how to use InDesign? I think a lot of people listening to this conversation now can attest to the fact that if you don't know at least a little bit about how to use these programs, you can waste so much time banging your head against your computer screen trying to figure out how to do a simple function. It's intuitive once you start getting used to it, but even that requires a certain level of education. I can't stress enough how important it is that if you plan on handling menu changes in-house, try to take advantage of taking at least a couple lessons in basic functionality for the program that your menu is set up in. There are a lot of easy ways to do this. I'm a big lover of Skillshare, which is an online platform that offers classes from professionals in a wide variety of topics, artistic topics. You can pay for a monthly subscription that is, pretty nominal, and then, there's no limit to how many things you can watch or listen to. Another thing that I like to offer to clients, but that is rarely taken up on, is just like, a basic 101 course where we can sit down, maybe even after we've already worried about the menu design and the menus in play, to play around together with InDesign and figure out how the functionality works best. The more basics you can learn if you're planning on handling this yourselves, the better off you're going to be and the less time you're going to waste. Now, all that having been said, it's not impossible to create a beautiful menu in Word, this program that all of us know how to use and probably everyone has on their computer. But you're more limited in your options. If you're making smart typographic choices and you can keep your menu quite simple, sort of like classically clean, let's say, then certainly you can create something in Word that is going to get the job done and still be quite lovely. But if you want any sort of extended ability for what your menu might look like, InDesign is probably the way to go. And it's time to have a really candid conversation with your designer about who's going to be using those files and the level of their knowledge, and then figure out how to get them up to speed enough to use the program efficiently, even if you're making small choices. As a designer, I can set up this file for you so that you can sort of mess up as little as humanly possible. There are ways to layer information so that certain layers are locked, like imagery, so you can't accidentally move those things around and you're only affecting type. I can group things together, so different elements on the page, sort of when you click on one, you click on all of them. That also makes it easier to move things like menu descriptions and titles around without accidentally messing up the spacing in between. But even then, a little bit of initial education is important to be able to use these files importantly. Next, let's talk really briefly about color. Again, any one of these topics we could get into in a really intense way and spend the entirety of our time together talking about only that. But especially now, as there's a larger move over to digital menus, within this time of COVID, it's really important to talk about the difference between Cmyk and Rgb, which are the two color spaces that files can exist in, right? It doesn't matter what type of file. If you're talking about your final menu, if you're talking about a photo, if you're talking about a logo, if there's any sort of color, even if it's black and white, it's either going to exist within the Cmyk color space or the Rgb. Cmyk is meant for print. It stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Just think about a regular printer. It's going to have each of these inks available to it, and depending on the shade that you want represented on the page, it's going to combine them in certain combinations in order to get your final color, right? Now, digital is Rgb. As you can see from this sort of layout here, the yellow line represents all of the colors that are available within the language of Rgb, and the dotted line represents all of the colors available in Cmyk. As you can see, they have a lot in common. There's a big sort of middle ground here of colors that you can create in one or the other, and it's going to show up the exact same way if you translate to the other color language, but there's a lot of room left over where these colors don't equate. When it comes to sort of bright colors, Rgb can do more because this is meant to show up on a computer screen, and it's using light to help represent a lot of these colors, whereas Cmyk is essentially using black, and the addition of darkness to create shades. What this means for you is that print and digital need files that are set up appropriately for those different platforms. Don't immediately think that because you have a menu that's set up for print that you can just put it onto your website and it's going to show up exactly the way you want it to show up. It really needs to be translated into Rgb color space. This is pretty simple to do. It just has to do with how you're exporting your files. Again, there are a lot of tutorials that you can find online about how to do this. It's just sort of one of those end finishing preparation moves that you make before you save the final file that you're going to be using. But it's really important that you do this because you want the colors that you designed on the screen within these files to be what ends up showing up for your users, right? You want to make sure that if you're creating something for print, that the colors that you're looking at digitally are going to show up, all those lovely shades of pink and purple are going to look exactly the way you want on a page. And what this means, especially for digital, is that if you create something within a digital or an Rgb color space, and then you just take that Rgb file and you print it, you might end up with a lot of colors that look aggressively duller than you meant for them to look, which can be a real bummer if you've created this, or your designer has created this beautiful thing. And from a branding standpoint, there really starts to mess with the consistency of your visual message, right? You want the green that shows up on one piece of branding to be the same shade of green that shows up on another piece of branding. And you certainly, because digital is so dependent on the screen that's being used, you want that green to look the same across multiple platforms. If you post an image on Instagram of your menu, you want that green to be the same shade that it shows up on as website, and not just on your phone or your tablet or your computer, but the one that your guest is using as well. This is not just for aesthetic purposes. There's a lot, which we'll talk about briefly at the end, that has to go into the legibility of your information. So you really want to make sure that those color contrasts are what you intend them to be in the first place. So I realize that this might be kind of a complex conversation for people that are trying to handle things themselves, but just be aware that Cmyk and Rgb exist for, they exist, and that one is meant for print and one is meant for digital information. And you need to make sure that you're saving your files in the right format, depending on where you plan on using them. Which also brings us to a brief conversation about file size and resolution. And I just want to say that, you're often going to have people, asking you, like if you're working with a designer, or say you're, working with, an event that's asking you for like, a file of your logo, something like that. They're going to ask you for something like a high res logo, right? And they're talking about the resolution, which is usually talked about in terms of DPI, which is dots per inch. When you print, you're, quite literally, the printer is creating small dots on a page. And the more dots that it makes, the crisper that information is going to look. Generally speaking, you want to make sure that when it comes to those, finishing exportation decisions that you're making for your files, that you're doing a high resolution image for print that's at least 300 DPI. Now, when it comes to web, there's a limitation to what a screen will actually show. It used to be across the board 72 DPI, so you can get away with these lower resolution images. But now technology is sort of catching up and creating these higher resolution screens that can show even more detail. So you tend to be looking somewhere between the range of 72 to 92 DPI. But again, file type is going to be really important here. Generally speaking, PDFs are used for print, and you're going to be using JPEGs and PNGs for web. PNGs are really important because you can save files with transparency. What that means is that if you have a picture of your logo and you put it on a page, perhaps a web page that has color on it, right? It's not going to show up with a white box behind it the way that it would if you saved that logo as a JPEG. It's going to show up with transparency behind it, so all you get is the color of the page and then this beautiful picture of your logo. PNGs also will display things in essentially a higher resolution, depending on how you scale it, where there's limitation to that with JPEGs. But it's important to keep in mind with digital platforms as well that a file type that is too large could be a thing that slows you down. So if you find that you've uploaded an image to your website, or whatever digital platform you're using, and it's really taking a long time for that page to load when you finally look at it, it may be because your file sizes are too large. And you might want to, play around with using a smaller, file size like JPEG, or saving your PNG at a lower resolution, so that these web pages will load faster. Just something to keep in mind when you're troubleshooting. So generally speaking, when you're talking about putting something in print, worry about an image being too small. I use this lovely image of a low resolution camel just to sort of illustrate this a bit. You can see he's fuzzy around the edges. If I were to print this camel, he wouldn't look fantastic, right? That having been said, I could probably use the same file size, especially if I was using it at a slightly smaller set of dimensions than I've used here, and upload it to something like Instagram, and I may find that the edges don't end up too fuzzy. So you may have to play around to find out what's working best for you. And again, these are questions you can always ask the graphic designer that you're working with. Just keep in mind that resolution does matter. And if you think something's going to show up in print, or it's going to be used in print, work at a higher resolution than you would if you were going to display something on the web. Okay. So now let's talk about menu format, which is something that I think is really exciting. And I think now, even in the midst of people, gravitating more towards digital, it's a really important conversation that sort of spans both digital and print in general. When it comes to this conversation of menu format, if we're talking about print, one of the questions, as I said, that I always ask upfront is, are you printing in-house? this is going to immediately affect the options available to you about what you can actually use as far as format is concerned. First is going to be, the actual dimensions of the paper that you're using. Even if you end up with, a really lovely laser printer that you've invested a good amount of money in, that's really going to make beautiful, end result menus, there's a limit to the paper size that you can put in to that laser printer, right? And so most of the time we're talking about letter size or 8.5 by 11. This letter size gives you a lot of options, right? You can do these, vertical full sheets. You can also print on 8.5 by 11 and fold horizontally. So you end up with, a spread of pages. Each are the dimensions of 5.5 by 8.5. As I showed you in the pouring ribbons menu, you can fold vertically and end up with something that's sort of lovely and long and end up with multi-pages that way. You can also cut these pages in half, so you end up with sort of these half sheet menus, which are kind of great for events and things like that. But generally speaking, this is probably going to be the format of the page that you're beginning with, right? You might be able to get away with printing on 8.5 by 14 inch. So, the same width that you're used to with a regular page, but much longer. This can be fun for things like, broadsheet styles, sort of these oldsy-timesy, long menus that you might see commonly used in things like bistros, right? You can also fold longer pieces of paper in interesting ways. So you can end up with something that's a bit like a brochure, right? That you're either opening wide to show what things that are inside, or folding in what we call an accordion fold, so that it's just a back and forth from page to page, and you can start breaking up information that way. But these are the dimensions that you're talking about if you're printing in-house. You're not going to be able to do anything larger than that. Smaller can be difficult as well, because depending on the printer that you buy, it might not be great at printing on smaller sheets of paper. It's one thing to print one smaller sheet of paper, and make sure that it's actually feeding through the machine correctly. It's something else to create 100 of those smaller sheets of paper, especially if you're printing both front and back. Depending on the printer that you choose, it might automatically be able to do that, or you might have to take your set of 50 menus, print the front side, and then refeed them into the machine and print them on the back side as well, which is usually the case if you're talking about something smaller than 8.5 by 11. So something to keep in mind there. This is also going to affect this idea of full bleed, which is when the ink color goes to the very edge of the page. You cannot do full bleed on an in-house printer. You can get pretty close these days, and I think that the technology is getting better at doing it. But even when you send something off professionally to be printed so that it has color that feeds right to the edge of the page, what they're doing is they're printing the page and they still have margins around that color, but then they're trimming it for you, either through a machine or they're doing it by hand. That's one of the things that you're paying for them to do. You can do that in-house too. Certainly, you can. I think a paper cutter is a very handy thing to have around, and you can trim edges off of a menu. But, again, as I said, it's one thing to do that for one menu or perhaps 25 menus. It's something else very much indeed to be doing that for 100+ copies of a menu. Trimming each one by hand, they're never going to be perfectly consistent, and that takes up a lot of time. So generally speaking, you might find that it's better to design things without the intention of full bleed, certainly if you're planning on doing the, the printing in-house. Color saturation, this is another big one. You're just never going to get as much saturation of ink on a page with an in-house printer as you could if you're sending things off to be printed professionally. What this means for me when I'm designing things is that I try not to create imagery that's like full color and that's really large. What you'll often find is when you print that on an in-house printer, you'll end up with streaks through the color, because it's so much ink that you're putting on the page that the machine can't quite make it look consistent. So sometimes it's better to use smaller imagery that's full color or line work, and not something that really requires these big, bold, large amounts of color, because it's just not going to look quite as professional once you're doing it in-house. Paper thickness. forgive the typo there, is also something that you're going to immediately have limitations, for when you're doing in-house printing. So when we're talking about paper thickness, just for a bit of context, when you're talking about a regular piece of paper that you would print any sort of normal document on, you're talking about something that is usually somewhere around 20 to 36 pounds. And it's pretty common to talk about paper width in terms of pounds. This is also known as bond paper sometimes. Also for context, something like a postcard or an index card is going to be something around 90 to 140 pounds in its weight. The max weight that you're probably going to be able to print through an in-house printer is going to be somewhere between 60 to 80 pounds. And again, sometimes you can get away with these larger paper thicknesses if you're only doing a couple copies, but if you're doing multiple copies, then it gets more difficult, and it's probably better to stick with something around 60 pounds, because the more paper that's feeding through the machine, the thicker it is, the more chances you're gonna have for paper jams, and the more likelihood there is that as the paper is feeding, it's going to sort of, on the rollers that actually feed it through the machine, it's going to wiggle back and forth a bit, which could end up smudging your ink or distorting imagery or type in ways that you don't want for your final product. So somewhere around 60 pounds is going to give you a paperweight that still feels substantial in hand, and you're still going to be able to really whip off a bunch of copies of it. Also important to keep in mind, if you want something that isn't necessarily going to when you hold it up to the light, isn't going to show through what you printed on the back of a page versus the front, which begs the question, are you printing front and back? And I think even when you're talking about menus that people aren't handling physically, but that you might be putting up in windows, especially now when you might be doing to-go or on sandwich boards or table tents, the thicker the paper that you can get away with, the more substantial it's going to look and feel, and the more it's going to hold up over long periods of use. A piece of paper that's thicker and that gets wet, which inevitably happens, as we all know, is probably still going to be used for a bit, versus a thinner piece of paper where the second you get it wet, the ink bleeds, it wrinkles, it looks weird, and you don't want to use it anymore. So finding a good width or depth of paper can really save you money in the long run, because you can use these pages over and over again. Or, like I said, if it's a tabletop or a sandwich board where you're putting multiple things, it's going to hold up to the elements a little bit better too, and just look a little bit more finished. Again, when we're talking about in-house printing, this is going to drastically affect your timelines for finishing projects. One of the things that I always really loved about pouring ribbons and printing in-house is that, we had time on our side. If we knew that we were going to launch a menu on a certain day, we could make final changes to that menu up until, even the day of, before we printed, our run of menus. Because, all this required was printing it out, taking a look at it, figuring out what we wanted to change, going into the menu and changing it in the file, and then printing it out again, right in back of house. If you're having something printed professionally, and this could be through, an independent printer or even some of your big box printers, you still have to build in a little bit of a timeline here, right? You're going to send them off the finished file, that's going to be designed in the format that they tell you they need it in. They're going to probably send you a proof, either digital or a printed proof, depending on what you decide you're most comfortable with. And you're going to have to approve that proof, potentially make changes, send it back to them before they can print, which means that you're building in, weeks before you plan on launching a menu, where you have to make sure that the information is right where you want it to be. So that's the short conversation about printing in-house. As I said, printing out of house or getting something professionally printed definitely has its plus sides. You can do full bleed printing. You might have greater options for color and really largely saturated amounts of color on a page. You certainly have more options with the weight of your paper or the finishing of your paper. If you want something that has a gloss on it, you can't do that on an in-house printer, but you could certainly send that out to be printed. But of course, what comes with all of this is cost consideration. It's going to be more expensive to hire a printer to take something for you. And there's sort of this cost of time as well, and your ability to make small changes to your menu before you finally launch it. One final thought about that, and this is important regardless of how you're printing, start with a small run. Think about the couple of days that you want to be able to get through with your initial menu, and how many menus you realistically need through one night or one day of service, you know, to make sure that everyone has a menu in hand or that there's a menu on every table. And then only, you know, pad that number a little bit, maybe add 5 or 10 menus just for safe measure, but then only print that amount of menus, because I guarantee you that once you put that menu into rotation, you're going to find things that you want to change. Either information that just like isn't landing with your guests, you know, they're not quite understanding the way you describe something. There will be typos, I promise you. There will always be a typo, no matter how careful you are. Or you may find that even like with cocktails, perhaps the execution that you initially intended isn't going to work. You know, like you've actually decided you want to switch up, you know, the type of glassware, or, you know, whether you're shaking or stirring. You know, these things always happen once you get into the practical application of a new menu. And so you want to be able to make those changes before the full run of the menu without wasting a lot of money on printing too many to begin with. So start small, spend at least a few days, if not a week, with that initial menu so you can really make note of the changes that you want to make, and then finally, you know, give it to your printer or print in-house on the longer run that you hope, you know, will last you for a while. Okay, let's talk about typography. Again, this is a whole aspect of menu design that we could spend so much time on, but we really can't get into it that aggressively right now. But I really want to point out this idea between serif and sans serif. Serif means that you're going to have what's essentially called decorative strokes. So you can see here, you know, these tiny little lines on the end of your S's or your R, you know, these bottom strokes on a lot of lettering. Sans serif means you have none of that, right? Serifs are an older style of typography. Sans serifs tend to be a bit more modern. Generally speaking, you'll find that long chunks of text, so like say, you know, a novel that you're reading is going to be set in serif, because it's generally thought that serif typefaces are easier to read than sans serif. Now, this is definitely one of those topics that has no definitive answer, because you'll find for your menu, different things might work. Whereas in the traditional book typesetting world, serif is really good for large amounts of copy. You know, within a menu, we're not necessarily using large amounts of copy, right? And you might find that sans serif ends up being a little bit more legible. You can see here, I pulled this image from fonts.com that shows a serif that isn't necessarily easily legible versus a sans serif that is much easier to read. We're going to talk a bit about point size in a second as well, but I just want to point out that both the serif and the sans serif here that I chose were both laid out in the same point size, and yet even the sans serif tends to look larger. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You might find that you prefer a serif versus a sans serif very much based on the voice of your menu and the general aesthetic of your program. If you're going for something that feels a little bit more perhaps romantic, or, you know, set in some sort of vintage vibe, serif is definitely going to be where you want to go. But then you kind of have to choose your typefaces carefully. Once you print on a page, if we're talking about print menus, these serifs can easily get lost. I've definitely set up menus where I began using a serif that I thought was really lovely, and how it looked on the screen was absolutely perfect. And then when I finally printed it, I found that because of just the very nature of ink soaking into a piece of paper, which especially if you're using a larger weight of paper, this ink's going to soak in more, the serifs were getting lost, and it was making it more difficult to read. You know, so that meant that I either had to change the typeface I was using altogether, or make the type larger so that these serifs were more legible. And then, as I said, we're going to talk a bit about point size and color finally. You know, if you're not asleep with, you know, with the conversation about all of these super practical considerations. When we talk about the size of type, we're going to talk about it generally in point sizes if we're talking about print, pixels if we're talking about digital. 12 points on a page, which is usually the default. Say if you're going into Word and you're, you know, writing a document, it's probably going to default to 12 point. A lot of, you know, email services are going to default to 12 point as well. 12 point equals 16 pixels. Good thing to keep in mind. This is because 16 pixels is generally considered the smallest you want to go when representing type on a digital platform. Anything smaller is going to start being very difficult to read. Now, granted, you know, the beauty of a screen is that you can sort of zoom in and out with your hands, you know, if you're using a smart tablet or your smartphone. But that's not really the user interface you want people to have to default to. You want to make things as easily legible right from the onset that you possibly can. And a big part of this is making sure that your point size or pixel size is not too small. You have to remember that what you're looking at on your screen as you're designing isn't necessarily the same as how it's going to look on the platform that it ultimately ends up on. This is tremendously important, especially when it comes to print, because you can't zoom in and out of print. Legibility is sort of set in stone the second you put it on a page. Now, where 12 point can sometimes look a little bit large on a printed page, you'll find that you don't want to go any smaller than 10 point. Sometimes you can get away with 9 point or 8 point, depending on the typeface that you're using, because even though, you know, you may be putting in the same point size across the board, depending on how that typeface was designed, it might look larger than, you know, another typeface, even at the same point size. But generally speaking, you'll find that 10 point is as small as you want to go with your information if you still want it to be legible. And even then, 10 point should be reserved for a sort of secondary information, which we'll talk about just in a second. If you're talking about the type of information that you want the eye to gravitate towards too quite quickly, you know, sort of the high spotted information that you want to make sure people immediately are drawn to, you want to at least do 12 point. Something like this, you know, where I wrote point size and color, now you're looking at something like 16, 18 points, something like that. And then if you're using, you know, sort of this display type and the splashy sort of like big stuff for titles of pages or things like that, you can go even larger depending on how much room you have on a page. It's pretty common to want to display type in smaller point sizes in order to make something fit on a page. But you're not necessarily doing yourself any favors when you do that. If it ends up being too small for people to read at the end of the day. I've played around a lot with what works on a printed page, and this, just generally speaking, is now a rule of thumb for me. If I can't put something in 10 point, you know, or maybe 9 point, maybe, then that means we need to have a discussion about how much information we're trying to fit on a page, you know, if we've already decided on the dimensions and, you know, of that page and how much page size we have to work with. Same goes for color. There are certain colors that are just less legible. Black type on white background is always going to be the most legible thing, right? Lighter colors like yellow are going to be more difficult to read on things like white. But even darker colors like red, this comes with a caveat. And this is where I'm going to say what might potentially be, to me, the most important thing I can possibly say to you within this lecture. Make sure to test out your final menu on the device in which you intend people to be using it. If it's print it out at the size you intend it to be for that final product. If it's digital, look at it on the website. Look at it on your phone, especially if you know the people are probably going to be using the smartphone either way. Because what a thing looks like when you're designing it versus how it actually translates on the page or on that final platform, it's gonna make a difference. I almost always find that regardless of my best intentions with design, when I design a page and then I print it, I generally find that type and point size needs to go up a little bit. Space between lines, so your leading, and needs to open up a bit, because something on paper just isn't as legible as it was when I was looking at it on my computer screen. Even if these are tiny amendments, they make a really big difference for the user. And light plays into this a lot. You can't just print off a page and look at it, you know, perhaps within your home or your apartment and say, great, this looks good to go. I'm sitting in my kitchen and I can read it just fine. You have to look at this finished image in the setting in which it's going to be used. Think quite seriously, is your space open during the day and at night? Is your space just open in the evenings? Are people going to be reading a menu by candlelight? Are they going to have sunlight to help them while they're reading? Is there going to be a transition between bright light into dark light? All of these things are really important, and you have to make sure to look at the printed image within these natural settings in which they're going to be used. No matter how much you're trying to stay conscious of these things while you're designing, you just don't know until you look at it on the page, because there are so many variables. How your printer is printing, how the paper takes the ink, how light is really affecting the color once you get it into its natural environment. Last year, I designed a menu for a space within the East Village, and it wasn't the first menu I had designed for them, and it's a space that I've been in many, many times. So I felt pretty confident upon this second project that I really understood the level of lighting within the space. You know, I knew that it was dark lit all of the time, that there were parts of the bar that had brighter lighting than you necessarily had at the tables. And so in the interest of time, before we ran that first small run to make sure everything works out well, I sort of tried to recreate the lighting circumstances within my home once I printed out that menu to make sure that everything was legible, and it seemed good to go. What was interesting is that once we finally got that menu into its natural environment, I had forgotten a really key aspect of the environment that never would have occurred to me. And that key is that the inset lighting over the tables, not even the bar where I usually spent my time, were red hued. What this meant was that any of the type that I had created in this dark red color on the page was immediately washed out by the lighting over the tables. So you could read the menu at the bar just fine, but the second you took it to a table and sat down, all of that type all but disappeared and became really, really difficult to take in. And for me, this was like a reminder lesson, you know, that no matter how well I think I understand the environment that something is going to be used in, you just don't know until you get it in there and you look at it physically. And the same happens for digital aspects as well. If you're going to use a menu that's going to be represented to people on a digital platform, look at it in the space. You know, take that iPad, take your smartphone, go sit at a table, and scroll through the menu and see if the lighting or the point size or even the general format isn't working for you. One of the most beautiful things about hospitality professionals is that even if you're not trained in graphic design, you're very much trained in user interface for your space, right? You know that space like the back of your hand, and you also know the ins and outs of reading a menu because we all frequent spaces as well. Those intuitions for user interface are true, no matter what your background is or how much training you have. And you know the truth of when you're looking at something in its natural environment and whether or not it's working and what needs to be adjusted. Okay, so I'm off of my platform about looking at things in its final print or digital format before you go live with it. So we've taken up a lot of time talking about these super practical aspects, and so I just want to touch upon this idea of menu psychology and the idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary information, just to sort of leave you with these lingering thoughts about how you're organizing information on a page and what you actually want to represent. I think it's very easy these days to celebrate thematic menus especially that look quite beautiful and forget that initial tenet that I told you, that this is a functional document. It's meant to relay your options to the guest in the most efficient way possible so that they can make an educated decision about what they want to purchase. And of course, you can layer that in all of these lovely ideas of aesthetic and voice, imagery, but it's still really important that they can get to the core information that they need as easily as humanly possible. We already talked a bit about how the eye sort of naturally scans the page. And of course, this is going to differ depending on format. So you may find that once you've actually printed a menu, what works in your space is quite different than what works in another space, right? Sometimes it's just, you have to practically see how things are going. But what you can do always is think about primary, secondary, and information and tertiary information, meaning what's the most important piece of information on the page, what's sort of the second most important piece of information that you want guests to look at, but maybe isn't going to factor into their decision quite as much. And then what's the bonus information? This is your tertiary information, right? So I'm going to go back for just a second to a page from the pouring ribbons menu to show you what I think of as essentially a unit of information that tends to happen on any cocktail page. And a unit is essentially whatever you group together to relay information about one selection, right? So this is usually going to include the name of a drink. Maybe it's an original house name, maybe it's a classic drink. It's generally going to have some line of description about that drink, and sometimes these are more detailed, sometimes they're extra simple, sometimes they don't exist at all. In the case of pouring ribbons, this would be tertiary information, this individual representation of where the cocktail sits on the matrix. This is information that, sure, it would be really nice for people to look at, and you want it to be there, kind of like these nuggets for the really invested reader. But if they're making a decision and they're making a snap decision, this isn't what they need to know. What they need to know is, what to call the drink by, whether it's the number or the name, and what goes in it, which is going to help them decide if they want to drink it, right? We could do a whole conversation about menu descriptions, and there's a lot that feeds into it. For me, this is essentially poetry, right? You're trying to evoke the feeling of a drink in a very limited amount of words. Certain programs will list out ingredients by brand name, or they'll leave it out. I think there's a lot to be talked about user inclusivity and this language of cocktails and what they're most likely to be able to understand in some sort of intuitive way versus making these descriptions too complex so that they read it, but it doesn't really mean anything to them, right? We could get into this for days, and we don't really have time right now, but maybe on a follow-up conversation. But think about this unit, on this particular page here, each cocktail has its unit of information, and each unit is built into this primary information, which we're doing in larger type and bolder type so that the eye is drawn directly to it. Secondary information, which is what's in the drink, which sometimes, we've all seen it. People might choose a drink solely based on the name and something that they like and not even look at the secondary information. Or they may scan it for words that are comforting to them, or particular styles of spirit that they know they want to drink for sure. And then this tertiary information, which it may very well be that 9 out of 10 guests don't even look at it. And if you find that there's room on the page to put it and you think it really gives added value to a thing, that's fantastic. But just realize that it may very well be that people don't look at it. And if you want to include it, it needs to not be taking away space or importance from the information that a guest definitely needs to have. Now, this pouring ribbons page is an example of quite a number of cocktail options on one page. I wanted to show you an example from an event that we did for Skurnik Wine and Spirits very early in the year. I find that event menus really allow for a little bit more playfulness with format, because if you're just using it for a one-off event, you can really sort of see what works and what doesn't. And you generally don't have to relay as much information on an event menu as you do in a regular menu. And oftentimes you're offering less selections, right? Less selections mean that you have more room on the page to play around. So we ended up doing a half-page print, and we only had 2 drinks. This was a Pretty in Pink themed menu. But I still had to keep in mind this idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary information, right? What's the primary information? People need to know the name of the drink. Secondary information, but practically primary information, they need to know what is in the drink. These are the 2 primary things that are going to help them make a decision about whether or not they want it. So the name of the drink is in larger point size, it's bold, it's meant for the eye to be drawn directly to it. Again, with this here, so that, these 2 bolder blocks of text, if you're looking at things in this idea of shapes on the page that the eye is naturally going to go to, the idea is that darker and bolder is where the eye is going to gravitate. And then you have the secondary information of what's actually in the drink. And, you know, we made choices here about what elements we were going to call by brand name versus what elements we were going to keep a little bit more generic based on what we were trying to highlight within the drink. Now, this was the Chiffard Crème de Pamplemousse Rosé Liqueur sponsored event, which means it was really the star of these drinks. And so brand name was used here, whereas tarragon, we were using a liqueur that was tarragon flavored, but if I had put the full name of that liqueur, it wouldn't have necessarily evoked this idea of tarragon as being a flavor component of the drink. So you're still making these really sort of editorial choices about what you're putting on the page. But again, secondary information, quick to read, easily found. And then because this was, you know, a little bit more of a playful menu, I included this tertiary information based on the idea that each of these drinks was inspired by a character within the movie Pretty in Pink. So this is a little bit more of just like a little bit of exposition about, you know, the vibe of this drink, whether or not it's playful, whether or not it's a little bit more spirit forward, you know. This was really fun information to add onto the page, but again, it's not the most important information. So it's smaller in point size. You know, because I had more room on the page, I could really give it a little bit of room. Normally on a regular menu with a lot of selections, you wouldn't be able to write 3, 4, 5 lines about, you know, what that drink is like, unless you decide that that's primary information, in which case it's a whole other conversation about where it goes on the page and at what size. But for me, this was tertiary information, which meant the guest may read it, the guest may not, but I want to have it there for them just in case. This is like next level. I hope that if we're having an extended conversation about the character of these drinks, that this information is going to come into play. But if someone's walking into the bar and they need to make a decision about what they want to drink, I need to make sure that they know the basics, the name of the drink, and what's in it. In this particular case, we had an account for these drinks, so people were drinking them for free. If they weren't, pricing information would have been tremendously important. I would argue that that's primary to secondary information that you want prominently displayed so that people really understand what they're getting into as far as cost is concerned, which we all know does factor into people's choices about what they want to drink or how much they want to drink. So that was a lot, and only really a beginning conversation about menu psychology and how that plays into design. But all of that stuff is kind of the cream on top of this, you know, really practical conversation about what you can do in-house, what you really need to discuss with the graphic designer. And regardless of what choice you make to do that, the language that's going to be involved in that conversation. The more aware you are of these elements of design as you're making decisions, the more important and the more functional your menu is going to end up. Even as someone that's not necessarily making the physical changes to the menu, after a long time writing out drink descriptions on the Pouring Ribbons menu and subsequently for other freelance, and understanding how that played into a guest decision to drink that drink or not to. As a bartender, I always thought about that right from the genesis of creating new drinks. You know, I may have come up with a flavor profile in a drink that I really liked and I thought was super compelling, but I always asked myself, how will that read on the page? And if I think that drink is just going to sound like it doesn't have a touchstone for the guest, like they're going to read all these ingredients, they're not going to sound appealing together, or, you know, it's not going to leave them with a general sense of flavor, then maybe I need to rethink that drink, or maybe I need to make sure that that cocktail is balanced out with more accessible types of drinks on the menu, or maybe I need to think about where that drink is going to be placed on the menu so that it doesn't get hidden because it's too intimidating for, you know, a drinker to really take on because they don't understand it intuitively. So I think even if you're not designing menus as a contributor to the drinks list, thinking about how something is going to ultimately end up in print can help you make good choices about what you want to put on the list. You know, always understanding that you're trying to balance the level of creativity you want involved versus, you know, how, you know, the practical consideration of how many of those drinks do you want to sell. And that's, you know, that's a decision in and of itself. So try and keep some of these ideas in mind as you're moving through this process. It's still a learning process. And as I said, there's no one solution for any particular space. But to be sure, all of these elements will come into play in some way or another. And that's the end of my soapbox conversation about initial menu design considerations.
Wow. And I always, when I'm talking to educators, I always say my requirements for education is that it's practical, relevant, and interesting. And you just hit all three of those boxes straight
Oh,
away. So
my goodness.
thank you so much. I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit myself just to a couple type thing.
Absolutely.
Firstly, obviously an area of the offer of a bar that has changed quite radically in the last couple of years is low no, in terms of, those spirit-free cocktails. Let's get away from mocktails and things like that. But I'm sure that's something that we could investigate in talking about this. But as a designer, as well as a bartender, do you think that low no should be in its own section, or that it should be integrated within the cocktail section, so we take away some of that stigma of, these are mocktails, virgin drinks, etc.? Where do you stand on that?
I think there are a couple of things to consider. How many of these types of low ABV to no ABV cocktails are you offering? If it's a substantial amount, this could very well just come down to a practical consideration where they don't fit on the same page as your regular house offerings. That having been said, a lot is going to depend on the importance you want to place on these drinks, because you say a lot by what page of your menu or what area of your menu you dedicate to where they're listed or their prominence. I think these days, because so many people are asking for these types of options, you want to make sure that they can find these things easily. And if you want to give them, if within your program you've put as much thought into these options as you have to any other cocktail on the menu, then by all means, they should be integrated in some way into the presentation of your classic house offerings. But you still have to make sure that people understand what they are. This could be really prominent icons on the page, just like you would indicate, drinks that are, or food that is vegan or vegetarian or something like that. You may highlight them with text boxes, lines that surround the offerings, but still put them on the same page as your, sort of like full throttle cocktails. But you may also find that if they need to have their own page, you need to make sure that that page has prominence if you're talking about a multi-page menu. I tend to find that if people have multiple pages in a menu, they're quick to overlook the first page. I saw that at Pouring Ribbons all the time. People will immediately thumb past sort of like that title page of a menu and go to like the page that's directly after it. If a menu's stapled, the centerfold tends to be an easy place to search. And the final page of a menu tends to be an easy place for people to look, or for you to direct people, especially while you're working, right? If you're trying to thumb through a menu really quickly and show them a thing. So maybe if these types of drinks are something you really want people to be able to find easily, or if you know that question is going to come up a lot, place it in one of these places of prominence that can easily be found on the menu, or that people are naturally going to gravitate towards. If we're talking about digital menus, don't put them all the way at the bottom of the page where people really have to scroll through to find them. Make sure that they're easily found sort of like above the fold if we're still talking about old school print conversations.
Brilliant. And a last question. I mean, you talked about a menu being a selling document or a selling tool. Absolutely true. I always used to claim that the highest compliment you could get for your menu was that people stole it.
Absolutely.
How do you feel? I mean, I worked in bars where we actively encouraged you to take a menu, put it on the front, take me with you, picture of a dog, take me for a walk, that sort of thing. How do you feel about, people stealing menus, people selling menus versus, don't touch the menu, you wouldn't do something like that? I mean, is that something you think, are people going to want to take this?
Yeah, for sure. The more beautiful a menu, the more people are going to want it. That's sort of the beauty of the experience, of dining out. If you're going to all this trouble to go to a destination space, spend your money there, almost like a playbill that you're taking after a theater performance, you kind of want that souvenir to take with you. And I think that's kind of the highest form of compliment when people very much want to take that thing. It means that they did have an enjoyable experience that they want to remember. And I think the end answer, if you're doing things in print, comes down to cost. Like, what did it cost for you to print that menu? chances are if you're doing it in-house, you know, the print cost is going to be smaller, and maybe you are just letting people take those menus. People are always going to steal them a little bit, right? But, you know, you're not worrying about selling it to people. If you're doing sort of full bound, beautiful documents that were out of print pieces, you know, out of house print pieces, you know, that cost a substantial amount more per menu, then, you know, people are definitely going to want to steal them, and you're probably going to want to offer them for sale and let people know, because you're kind of like setting the rules for them up front that these things are for sale. But I think, you know, like there's something to be said for not gouging people on the price and still making it something that you can sell to them. But you have to build that in as well. If you know that you're going to be giving away a certain amount of menus over the course of a menu run, then you have to print enough menus to make sure that you still have enough left in house for regular service. So there can be a lot of considerations just from like a simple cost standpoint about what's going to work and what doesn't. And I think it's really important now that we're in this moment where digital is becoming so much more important to think about what is going to replace that souvenir, you know, as a lasting impression of user experience when they're at a space. If you're showing people the menu digitally, is there something that they can leave with that makes them feel like they have a souvenir from that from that experience? So maybe you're not doing print menus anymore, but you know, maybe you're printing matchbooks, which is still sort of like, I love how they've stood the test of time as this beautiful memento of experiences. Maybe you're creating small enamel pins where it's just like you can give them away. Some sort of like postcards, check presenters, that sort of thing. Something tangible that people can take with them, because I think that's still really important. And now if we're transitioning more to digital menus, we have to think about how we're going to replace that as a lingering example of people's time with us in our spaces.
Fantastic. It makes me want to go to the Connaught, because if you go to the Connaught when you leave, they give you the little envelope filled with the recipe cards of the drinks you've just drunk on. So,
it's lovely. I just don't think there's any replacement for that type of thing.
It makes me even thirstier. Amanda, thank you so much for your time today, your expertise. I am sure this is going to generate a lot of questions, and when they allow drinking again in New York bars, we should get together, sit there, look through a few menus, and go down some of these rabbit holes.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Amanda.